Let me go ahead and share my screen. Oh, hey, Adam, I can't share my screen. Can you change that? But while Adam's doing that, I can go ahead and get started. So, um, last week, can everyone see that? Okay. So last week, we kind of just did a little bit of survey and just kind of started with the question of, is science and faith in conflict and why we should really pay attention to that and why does it matter? And here on out, we'll start getting to the meat of it all and really start talking about some of these issues. So the first one I started with today is just, how did the universe get here? And obviously Genesis talks about that a lot. And then also in science, we have the Big Bang. And just to reiterate kind of the series purpose, this is not to convince you or force you to agree with any of these ideas, but hopefully it is to inform us about current scientific understanding of these key topics and to challenge us to rethink or reaffirm our beliefs and viewpoints of God. And then ultimately, we kind of want to lead to this point that to realize that what may be non-issues for us may prevent others from coming to Christ. So just to outline today's class, because we'll get kind of heavy on how the universe got here, I kind of have like 4 questions we kind of want to ask and go through. So the first question is, just how does the Bible say the universe was created? And then obviously Genesis was written for the Israelites coming out of Egypt. So trying to know what were the other prevailing creation stories at the time when Genesis was written for the Israelites. And then going into how does science say the universe was created and going into the Big Bang and going into all what that means. And then the last point that will be is, can these both be rectified together and can there be no conflict between the two? So if you have your Bibles, we're going to be in Genesis 1, reading through that. So you can either turn there. I also have the verses up for us to see. And I would love if we could have some readers. We'll need about 6 readers tonight for the segments I have in Genesis 1. So if someone would love to read Genesis 1 through 7, verses 1 through 7. Any takers?
No, I can do that. Can you hear me okay?
Thanks.
Okay. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it, and it was so.
Okay, thank you. Great. So I'll kind of break up the segments a little bit more as we go on and talk about kind of days 1 through 3, but we'll go on to the next couple of days. So if someone could read verses 8 through 13 for me, that would be fantastic.
I've got it. God called the vault sky, and there was evening, and there was morning the second day. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered into one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and then gathered waters he called sea. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and the trees bearing fruit with seed in it, according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day.
Thanks, Mark. So just what kind of comes to me when I read this, and a lot of people have kind of established these like literary devices, is that these first 3 days are really kind of separating spaces. And so there's this really intense patterning to it. And there's a bunch of different podcasts that go through Genesis 1 and a lot more detail that I can go into tonight. But if you kind of just think on day one, there's separation of light and darkness. Day two, there's separation of these waters. And then day three, there's a separation of land and water. And just a couple of things that I would point out that just strike me as odd. And I know a lot of us have read this all the time, and we're taught this extremely early in life if we grow up in the church. But if you kind of look at it, in the first two verses, the Spirit of God's hovering over these waters. And in ancient times, water is always kind of associated with chaos. Almost all the creation narratives start with water in their midst of it. And Genesis 1 is not any different, that there's just this water everywhere. God's Spirit is hovering upon it. And then he starts the creation narrative where there's this separation of light and dark. And we'll get into this later with days 4 and 6, but right now we don't have any sun and stars. So there's this divide that now there's this space where things can exist in the light. And then we separate the waters, making this little air bubble where we can live. And then he actually gives us land to live on. So there's just a couple interesting things about the creation narrative there in days 1 through 3 that we can kind of think about and go on with. So then if we move on to days 4, if someone would want to read verses 14 through 19.
I'll read that.
Thank you.
And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the 4th day.
Thanks, Nicole. So now we have some stars and the sun finally. And now we'll go on to day 5.
I'll take that one.
Thanks, Karen.
And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the water teems and that moves about in it according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, and he said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning the 5th day. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good.
Great. Thanks, Karen. Now we have the 5th day, and we also have part of the 6th day. And then we get to the pinnacle of creation. And if someone would read the last couple of verses. Okay, I can take it. So then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image and in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and then the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." And similar to days 1 through 3, we also have a similar pattern in days 4 through 6. Oh, sorry, actually, I'll finish this. Then God said to you, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning the 6th day. So if we kind of look at day 4 through 6 with the same kind of mindset that we see in days 1 through 3, now we see that God's filling those spaces that he created. So in day 1, we have separation of light and darkness, and then in day 4, he fills it. He has the creation of sun, moon, and stars. And then day 2, we have separation of the waters. So we have now the water and then the air, and God fills the air and the water with fish and with birds. And then when day 3, we have separation of land and water. We also have creation of plants, and then we filled it with animals and most importantly humans. So kind of basically God's creating space, like separating spaces and then filling them. And I think that's really unique to Genesis creation story as compared to other creation narratives. And we'll keep coming back to Genesis 1 throughout this series. And there's different points that I'll talk about each time. I'll just mention them briefly because when we get into evolution and creation, we'll really talk about verse 26 a lot with the idea of God saying, let us make mankind in our image and our likeliness and what that means. So I won't be able to dive into every little aspect that we can go into Genesis tonight. But I just want to hopefully reiterate to you guys, and hopefully we can re-see this, that Genesis 1 is very unique in how it goes about, and it's also very methodical in how it goes about as well. So, what does this kind of say about God? One more thing. So if you read Genesis 1, your idea of the universe would kind of liken to how the Hebrews viewed the universe. So this is how the ancients viewed the universe. So we have the columns of earth holding it up, coming out of these chaos waters, as God said. And then we kind of have this air bubble that has this vault in which there are waters above with the floodgates, which is opened by God in the story of Noah. And then you also have all the fixed stars and moon and sun in the firmament up in the sky. And then obviously the land where the humans and animals are on. And also, if you're a flat earther, this is also what you believe, FYI. This is similar to how they think of the world. So, Genesis days 1 through 6, very likened to how the ancients viewed the world. And so an argument I would kind of make is that God didn't really, he kind of met them where they are. He's like, okay, you guys are coming out of Egypt. You've been in slavery for 400 years. And he tells Moses to write this down. And he says, okay, this is how the universe is, and God created it. And so it definitely gives the Hebrews a purpose, as well as knowing that this is the world that God made, and this is how he made it. And so there's a real distinct purpose for writing it this way, because it fits their worldview, and it also proves to them that God did it all. And so those are just a couple points I want to make. But if you kind of look at it more from kind of a secular viewpoint of Genesis, and you go into the origins of the book of Genesis, I actually found this really interesting when I was researching for this class. I hope probably many of you always thought it was traditionally credited to be written by Moses. A lot of Christians still hold that viewpoint. That's been disputed by some secular historians. And if you agree with what I think that it was written by Moses, there's many verses in the Old Testament and the New Testament that confirm Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. If you go off of that, it's most likely written during the 40-year wandering in the desert, so that's roughly 1200 BCE. And that is disputed by some secular historians. And the reasoning for this, and even some seminaries actually teach this as well, is that they believe Genesis was not fully written in the version we have it now until about 500 years ago, or 500 BC. And this was after the Babylonian exile, and they were coming back, so in the time of Nehemiah and Ezra. And the reason why they think this is because they think Genesis was actually this amalgamation of 4 different authors. There's the Elohist version of Genesis, they claim, and its different chapters are written by that author. And then they have the Yahweh author, Deuteronomy, and then the priestly text. So if you Google this at all, you can read it more in depth. I have some resources at the end. I thought it was really interesting. I personally don't agree with some of the things they said, but if you want more information on that, it's definitely interesting. For one thing that they argue is that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are both creation narratives. And I'm not sure if anyone has really paid attention to that much. And we'll get into Genesis 2 more when we get into evolution versus creation. But Genesis 1 kind of has this whole story of creation that we just read, and then Genesis 2 is basically just the story of the creation of humans, and it's much more personal and much more intimate. And they argue that in Genesis 1, the version of God they use is called Elohim, which is just spiritual being in Hebrew. And then in Genesis 2, they argue now it's switched to Yahweh. And so that's one of the secular arguments to say, oh, well, Genesis 1 was written by this person a long, long time ago. And then Genesis 2 was written by someone in the 500, 600 year range. I dispute that just because the ancient Hebrews didn't really think like that. I think that in Genesis 1, they show, oh, the spiritual being created the world. And they go, oh, okay, who is this spiritual being? And then you come with Genesis 2 and say, oh, the spiritual being is Yahweh, the I am, this creator God who wants to know you personally and is very, wants to intimately make you and mold you like he did Adam. So just so you guys are aware of what some people are saying out there about the origins of the book of Genesis. But I think it's important to know also what's also being said about the creation of the world at the time that the Israelites are thinking it's according to this through Yahweh. So, before that, last week we had polls. I know not everyone was able to do the polls, as some people did in the chat. And so I didn't want to do something that if not everyone can do it. So for this week, I'm just going to pose a question and you can unmute yourself and answer it. So I have about 3 or 4 of these questions throughout the class tonight. So the first question is, viewing Genesis 1, how does that impact your view of God? I would like to say there are no wrong answers, no stupid answers, anything would take. Personally, for me, I think it makes him all powerful, that he can just speak and everything is created. And I would love to hear you guys' viewpoints of God based off what we've read in Genesis 1.
Okay, I'm pausing the recording, by the way.
Go ahead, I guess, and restart it. Yeah, thanks. So really great answers, really good thoughts. We'll keep kind of chugging along. So now we kind of really establish, what Genesis says about God creating the world, steps, the order. We'll dive more into Genesis 1 as we go along through this course, because Genesis 1 is extremely deep, especially when God gives dominion for humans over animals and birds and fish, what all that means. We can go really deep into that. But kind of comparing it with some of these other creation narratives that were around for the Israelites that were influencing them. So obviously they just came out of Egypt when they're told this creation narrative of, God creating the world. So obviously the Egyptian creation narrative is somewhat similar. It starts the same way. There are these chaos waters that exist. And it was really interesting to read it because, at least to our knowledge, Genesis 1 is very, in Jewish literature, it's all the same. There's not any different copies of it. There's not any different versions of it. The Egyptian creation narrative changes drastically based off which city you're in, because they want their patron god to be the starter. So the one I found was Atum, but it changes based off which city you find the text in. But it's basically this first god that rises up out of the waters and basically kind of creates land for people to be on. And it's lonely, basically. It doesn't like being by itself. And so it basically replicates with itself, basically, and it gets 2 other gods to come out of him. And they don't like being with him, and so they leave. And they go off on the waters to go explore the rest of the world. And he sends out his eye to go and find them, which is kind of interesting. And that becomes like an all-seeing eye and the pyramid and stuff. That's where that history comes from. And the eye finds the kids, and the kids come back, and the god's so happy, he cries tears of joy, and the joy hits the land, and out comes humans. And when you have humans, basically the gods tell them, oh, you are supposed to serve us and make us happy so that we're not ever alone and sad again. And so it kind of reinforces this idea that the Egyptian rulers and pharaohs were trying to enforce, is that there are people that are above you and there are people below you. And the people below need to serve the people above. And it really reinforces that when you read the text, which I think is different to the Genesis 1 creation narrative. So that's the Egyptian one. The Babylonian one is very similar. There it comes. So once again, you're starting with chaos waters. Similar story, another god kind of rises up out of it. It also has another god where it makes all these younger generations of gods. and then you have a war between the younger gods and the older gods, and a lot of death happens, a lot of destruction happens of the world. One of the younger gods named Marduk wins, and he's kind of the patron god for the Babylonians. And so he wins this big, glorious battle, and he kills one of the original gods and also one of these instigator gods that started the war. And from their blood and guts, he sprinkles it on the ground, and mankind pops up. And because of that, out of this kind of war and out of this kind of treachery that these things prop up, they're also kind of assumed kind of treachery and out of that. And so they're also meant to serve the gods, which also kind of reinforces what Gilgamesh wanted and all these kind of Babylonian rulers wanted, is that they're a god king and they're in charge and you're supposed to serve them. So in both of these stories, it's kind of reinforcing that that humans are not co-heirs, they're not meant to be equal with God, but that they are in fact inferior, and that they should be serving and working and toiling away for their gods. And so that kind of brings us to, what does that mean for the Israelites? They're also getting inundated with these creation narratives as well. So I'd ask the question to everyone, how does Genesis, compare and contrast with the Egyptian and Babylonian creation narratives? And for me personally, obviously it both starts off with these chaos waters, but I think after that they completely diverge. And I think, as we mentioned previously, God's extremely intentional and all-powerful, and kind of does this lovingly, and it's out of goodness as well. But the Egyptian Babylonian creation narratives, it's kind of chaotic the whole time, and then there's war and loss and despair, and humans are kind of just a byproduct of that on the side that's not intentionally made. But I would love to see and kind of hear what you guys think about that as well. Kind of moving on. So now we have an idea of what Genesis said about the creation narrative, and then we know some of the stories that were around at the same time that Genesis and that was impacting the Israelites and how that might affect them. But then how for us modern day Christians, what is science saying? It's a kind of alternative creation narrative. So how does science say the universe was created? So the most widely accepted theory is the Big Bang theory. As to how the universe came into existence. And the second most, which is not talked about a ton, is actually an extension of this theory, and it's called the Big Bounce theory. I always struggle with explaining this to people, so I did find a pretty good video to show. Hopefully we won't have any technical issues showing it. It's on YouTube, and so hopefully it'll work, and then we can kind of talk about it in more depth. Okay.
The beginning of everything, the Big Bang.
Is everyone hearing
idea
it?
that the universe was suddenly born
Yes.
and is not infinite. Up to the middle of the 20th century, most scientists thought of the universe as infinite and ageless. Until Einstein's theory of relativity gave us a better understanding of gravity, and Edwin Hubble discovered that galaxies are moving apart from one another in a way that fits previous predictions. In 1964, by accident, cosmic background radiation was discovered, a relic of the early universe, which together with other observational evidence made the Big Bang the accepted theory in science. Since then, improved technology like the Hubble telescope has given us a pretty good picture of the Big Bang and the structure of the cosmos. Recent observations even seem to suggest that the expansion of the universe is accelerating. But how did this Big Bang work? How can something come from nothing? Let's explore what we know. We can ignore the beginning part for now. First of all, the Big Bang was not an explosion. It was all space, stretching everywhere, all at once. The universe started very, very, very small and quickly expanded to the size of a football. The universe didn't expand into anything. Space was just expanding into itself. The universe cannot expand into anything because the universe has no borders. There is, by definition, no outside the universe. The universe is all there is. In this hot, dense environment, energy manifested itself in particles that existed only for the tiniest glimpses of time. From gluons, pairs of quarks were created, which destroyed one another, perhaps after giving off more gluons. These found other short-lived quarks to interact with, forming new quark pairs and gluons again. Matter and energy were not just theoretically equivalent, it was so hot they were practically the same stuff. Somewhere around this time, matter won over antimatter. Today, we're left with almost all matter and nearly no antimatter at all. Somehow, 1,000,000,001 matter particles were formed for every 1,000,000,000 particles of antimatter. Instead of one massive ultimate force in the universe, there were now several refined versions of it acting under different rules. By now, the universe has stretched to 1,000,000,000 kilometers in diameter, which leads to a decrease in temperature. The cycle of quarks being born and converted back to energy suddenly stops. From now on, we work with what we have. Quarks begin forming new particles, hadrons, like protons and neutrons. There are many, many combinations of quarks that can form all sorts of hadrons, but only very few are reasonably stable for any length of time. Please take a moment to appreciate that by now, only 1 second has passed since the beginning of everything. The universe, which has grown to 100 billion kilometers, is now cold enough to allow most of the neutrons to decay into protons and form the first atom, hydrogen. Imagine the universe at this point as an extremely hot soup, 10 billion degrees Celsius, filled with countless particles and energy. Over the next few minutes, things cooled and settled down very fast. Atoms formed out of hadrons and electrons, making for a stable and electrically neutral environment. Some call this period the Dark Age, because there were no stars and the hydrogen gas didn't allow visible light to move around. But what's the meaning of visible light anyway, when there's nothing alive yet that could have eyes? When the hydrogen gas clumped together after millions of years and gravity put it under great pressure, stars and galaxies began to form. Their radiation dissolved the stable hydrogen gas into a plasma that still permeates the universe today and allows visible light to pass. Finally, there was light. Okay, but what about the part we didn't talk about? What happened right at the beginning? This part can be defined as the Big Bang. We don't know at all what happened here. At this point, our tools break down. Natural laws stop making sense. Time itself becomes wibbly-wobbly. To understand what happened here, we need a theory that unifies Einstein's relativity and quantum mechanics, something countless scientists are working on right now. But this leaves us with lots of unanswered questions. Were there universes before our own? Is this the first and only universe? What started the Big Bang? Or did it just occur naturally based on laws we don't understand yet? We don't know, and maybe we never will. But what we do know is that the universe as we know it started here and gave birth to particles, galaxies, stars, the Earth, and you. Since we ourselves are made of dead stars, we are not separate from the universe. We are part of it. You could even say that we are the universe's way of experiencing itself. So let's keep on experiencing it until there are no more questions to ask. The beginning of everything, the Big.
Okay, so hopefully people found that somewhat hopefully easier to follow than me trying to explain and talk about all this stuff. And I'll keep trying to find good videos if I can, just because it seems to always help me personally understand it. So that's what scientists say. And as they mentioned, we do not have a currently accepted theory as to what caused the Big Bang. And as a scientist, that's the question I immediately go to is like, what caused it? And so this is where I come personally as a scientist, and other scientists I've talked to have come to similar observations. But as a scientist, we always prove theories and stuff by observations. You can make an hypothesis, but you have to prove it by observing it. Unfortunately, we'll never be able to observe what happened before the Big Bang, because we as beings made up of matter, we can't observe and understand things before there was matter. And there are a couple of theories people have out there that I'll talk about in a second. But it leaves us, I think, with three options that we get from the Big Bang. So option number one, I think it's something that a lot of us go with in the Church of Christ field especially, is that we can just say faith is right and the Big Bang did not happen, because it's a little bit too confusing for us and it's a little bit hard to understand. And it's easier to understand, the 7 days of creation as explained in Genesis 1. So we can easily say that. I think an option two you have, if you're from a secular world, is you can say science is right. How you explain that is through a theory that's called the multiverse theory, and it's extremely dense, and I fully don't understand it. But basically, the simplistic idea of it is that we have life here on the universe because we are alive. And so how do we explain that if it's just random chance? Because all these different factors, all constants for gravity, constants for different things, speed of light constant, if all those things are slightly off, life cannot exist. And so if it is random, that means you need to have a universe that has those constants slightly different. So you need to have infinite permutations of all these different things, and that we're the one that's capable of having life. And a lot of scientists who are hardcore particle physicists and theoretical physicists do believe in the multiverse theory. Personally, for me as a biologist, it's really hard to wrap my head around. And personally, for me, it's easier to wrap my head around God creating the universe than the multiverse theory. And so that's where it leaves, personally, for me as a scientist, is that you can easily say, I think, that both are right and that God initiated the Big Bang. Because we'll never know what happened before the Big Bang. And so I think logical conclusion is you need some kind of infinite being to start it. So I think those are three options. Maybe you guys can come up with others. But I think three of them are possible, and I think two are definitely more likely. And so that's how we kind of rectify, at least for me, the Big Bang in faith, is that we'll never know what happened before it. And so if we do accept that the Big Bang occurred, that's your options. I don't think I left the space for it, but if anyone wants to unmute and ask a specific question about the Big Bang, you're welcome to at this point. I know it definitely can be confusing, but I hope the video did explain some of the stuff. But we'll also ask this question if you don't want to talk about the question of the Big Bang, is, if the Big Bang occurred through God or if it just occurred in general, how does that impact your view of him? And for me personally, the 7 days of creation is easy to wrap my head around as just a human being. The scale of eternity and the scale of billions of years is harder to wrap my head around. And so if this did occur, it definitely changes how I view God, because I think it really stresses the importance of his eternal nature, and that he does not play by our rules, that he plays by his own rules, and that he is fine and willing to be patient for his creation to create beings that he can converse with. But restart us. Okay. And Joe kind of got to some of these points I was going to make later. So, why does this really matter? I think first and foremost that viewing God through the lens of Genesis 1 and or, the Big Bang, I think it changes how we view him. And as you learn more about God and learn more about the world, I think it changes how you view things. And I think the same can be viewed of God. God is always the same, but how we view him is always changing, I believe. Two, I struggle with how to word this concisely, but I put it as knowing more about the Big Bang kind of keeps the conversation going. I remember being younger and in high school, talking to people about God and talking to them about Jesus. And some people know these buzzwords. And so they'll say, oh, well, what do you think about the Big Bang? And if you say, oh, I don't believe in the Big Bang, it kind of stops the conversation completely, because they can say, oh, I believe in the Big Bang. And they can kind of walk away from you. But if you just kind of know basic things, it was like, oh, okay, well, what do you think about the Big Bang? Do you think, it was this kind of hot mess and it kind of slowly expanded and slowly stars were formed under intense gravity and all of these things start happening? And most people do not know any of that. They just know the buzzword of Big Bang. And so if you can kind of catch them on that and get them to start questioning some of these things or really start thinking about it more, I think it keeps the conversation going. And then my kind of third point I put is I say that it creates a faith that is stronger than science. And an extension of this point is something that I personally believe. And I believe that science will never prove nor disprove the existence of God. I think there will always be some kind of theory, always something that can lead people astray to say there is no God. At the same time, I don't think we'll ever hit a point where we go, oh, well, we don't know how to solve that. We don't know. And it definitely proves the existence of God. I think God designed his text and designed the world in such a way that we will always have free will to choose him or not to choose him. And we'll talk about that more as we go on, especially the last lesson. But I think if you create a faith that says, you know, I believe in God no matter what, that even if science is able to prove the Big Bang and prove all of some of these theories, if that doesn't shake your faith, then you have a very strong faith. And so that's why I think it's important to kind of know some of these topics. And if you want more resources than kind of what I went through today, for some of the different stuff kind of going chronologically through it, there's a website called answersingenesis.org. It's Christian based. And they go through kind of did Moses write Genesis and give the start for that for the things I talked about then. There's also blueletterbible.org, and they have a good article about who wrote the book of Genesis. There is also the Bible Project podcast, which is one of my favorites. If you're more of a head Christian than kind of an emotional or heart Christian, it will really speak to you. He really dives into Greek and Hebrew and all these different things. But they have a podcast series called God, and they really talk about kind of all the instances of using God throughout the Bible. It's really fascinating. As far as for the science, the Kurzgesagt has some really great videos on other things as well outside of the Big Bang, and they're pretty good. There's also livescience.com is a really good website, and for a bunch of different topics, which is also secular based. And there's also a secular based movie I put on here. It's available on Amazon if you're a Prime member. It's called Particle Fever. It's based off the Hadron Collider, particle collider, and basically it kind of walks them through it as a documentary of the discovery of the Higgs boson particle, which is basically one of these first particles that was made after the Big Bang. And they also talk about the multiverse theory in that film as well. So if you're wanting to know more about the Big Bang, it's a really good resource. But yeah, so that is it for today. Hopefully it's a little bit more insight on the Big Bang, a little bit more insight on how all this can wrap together. Next week, we won't have as much faith in it and less verses to read. It'll be more kind of heavy science on whether it's an old Earth or a young Earth. And then the next week after that, it's going to be really good. It's going to be, we'll start talking about evolution versus this creation with Genesis 2. So that's the next 2 weeks. Looking forward to it. If anyone has any closing comments, that'd be great. And then we can take a prayer request.